I've got to say I am deeply shocked and offended by the statements that were just made, especially regarding me, but the larger context too. So the gentleman from Minnesota read a quote that he attributed to me, and it's a statement I made, but it was about the killing of Tyrese Nichols. Now, Tyree Nichols was the gentleman in Tennessee who was beaten to death over a period of like 10 to 15 minutes by, I believe it was 6 police officers. In fact, I remember watching the video, and there were multiple videos because they had different angles. One of the officers who had been beating him got tired, stepped away so he could catch his breath, and then came back to continue beating him. I'd never seen anything like it. I was shocked. I had cases when I was the state's attorney where police officers used excessive force, and I prosecuted those cases. In some cases, we convicted those individuals. But I guess my colleague from Minnesota thought that the beating death of Mr. Nichols was good policing. But keep something in mind. The chief of the police of that department fired those officers because he recognized that that had crossed the line that good police officers recognize and follow every day, under every circumstance and in every situation. I thought that's what we were going to honor this police week, to sort of hold up the Tyree Nichols scenario as an example of what police officers are supposed to be doing during police week is insane. I can't believe it. But that's what he did. Let me say this. It's important for us to make sure that we walk and chew gum at the same time. We want to honor good policing for sure, because every community needs it. We need police officers who go out and do they respond to calls for robberies or shootings or whatever. But even they've recognized over time that the bad apples and the ones in Tyree Nichols' case were clearly not just bad apples, but about as bad as you can get. They have to be separated out because it's important for the police to police themselves. I know it's hard, but we've got to make sure that they do it. And he mentioned body cameras a moment ago. Guess why we have body cameras? That was one of the innovations that was made to address excessive force. And guess what? One of the things that's led to is better policing. When I first ran for state's attorney in Prince George's County, one of the issues I ran on was videotaping interrogations. And I wrote an op-ed. It was called Safeguards for the Innocent. And I was joined by the former head of the homicide unit here in Washington, D.C. We wrote it together. And the reason we wrote it was because we knew that if you videotape these interrogations, and we'd had a flurry of false confessions that had been made in Prince George's County, and we knew they were false because they were proven to be innocent by DNA evidence. So we knew they were false confessions. And so we made this change to try and address that. And guess what happened? Initially, the police officers had opposed it, but the good detectives realized quickly that the videotape showed the great work that they were doing and they were going about it the right way. And the juries appreciated that too, because then we could just bring it in, set up the video, hit the tape, and the jurors could see for themselves and make the decision. That's good policing. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we hold police officers, just like we do prosecutors or any other law enforcement profession, to a basic level of following the law, even as they try and protect us from misconduct. Now, I guess this is kind of the par for the course now for my Republican colleagues. The January 6th piece, for example, we've got people running around on the other side of the aisle who are calling the perpetrators of January 6th, the rioters of January 6th, they're calling them hostages and patriots, the people who were patriots who participated in it, according to them, and the ones who've been prosecuted and convicted and jailed, even though I think over 900 of them pled guilty, but others were convicted after jury trials. They've had their day in court, they've had their due process, they were rightly convicted and held accountable, they've been sentenced to jail, but we still have people over there calling them patriots and hostages, even though 5 officers died as a result of January 6th, and many others were injured too. So I'm hoping, again, this is Police Week, and I'm hoping that we can get back to trying doing things in a bipartisan way here. But based on what I heard from my colleague from Minnesota, that's not likely to happen. It's important to make sure that we do this. We've got to make sure that we recognize the challenges we've faced in law enforcement. And I support law enforcement, as I mentioned earlier. We've got legislation to try and increase the number of police officers who are going to be out there on the street, because we need more police officers on the street. But the George Floyd Act, which was referenced, I think, a minute ago, is aimed at making sure that in addition to having more on the street, they do the job in the right way. Now, when I first got elected, we didn't have iPhones very often. And so we'd prosecute these cases. We'd present the evidence to the jury, excessive force cases, and many times the jury would reject it. One of the transformations that happened with the iPhone, though, was that people standing there on the street while excessive force was taking place, they videotaped it. And then they were able to bring that to the police, and cases that probably wouldn't even have been charged previously were not only charged, but led to convictions. The George Floyd scenario, the person who that legislation's named after, is a paradigm example of that. Derek Chauvin was there with his knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. The police report that he filled out and the other colleagues on the street made no mention of all of that, but the videos made it clear that Derek Chauvin had basically just strangled him to death with his knee. And he was held accountable. And the other officers around him, who basically did nothing while it was happening, they were held accountable too. Now, hopefully my colleagues, maybe my colleague from Minnesota, had that in mind when he made some of the statements he just said a few minutes ago. I sure hope not, because officers who do that belong in jail. They shouldn't have a badge, a gun, and a license to kill. That has to be given to the people who we can trust to enforce the law in the right way. And the vast majority of police officers, that's how they do it, and that's why we appreciate and respect them. But when they cross the line, I hope we don't have people like the gentleman from Minnesota who's going to act like that's okay, because it's not. We've got to hold them accountable. Now, a minute ago I mentioned serious legislation. It's a little surprising to me we're having such a debate like this over legislation that's just a resolution, basically. It speaks only of defund the police and the like. But the Democrats in the last Congress, for example, we passed meaningful reforms to support police, even though in many of the instances they were opposed by Republicans. So, last Police Week we passed H.R. 6943, the Public Safety Officer Support Act, which extended death benefits to law enforcement officers with PTSD. It came over the objection of 17 Republicans, including 4 on the Judiciary Committee. Last Police Week, H.R. 2992, the Traumatic Brain Injury Law Enforcement and Training Act, passed legislation as well. 21 Republicans objected to that as well. Now, we keep passing legislation, or we did when the Democrats were in control, to actually provide additional resources and benefits to police officers who get injured in the line of duty, and I think that's important for us to continue to do. But our colleagues aren't doing that. They're bringing this political legislation, and it got real political a minute ago when the gentleman from Minnesota was up there, frankly kind of ranting about things he attributed to me, which I think was wrong and incorrect. But more importantly, things he keeps trying to attribute to Democrats and the change in policy. A couple other quick points about some of the things he said. The decline in police officers. Now, I got to be clear. One of the things we have in the bill I did with Mr. Hunt was we got a report that's going to come and study this, because I think it's going to help address a lot of the misinformation that's coming out on the other side about why we're having some shortages. And they're saying it's based on the defund the police slogan, but the roots of these shortages started many, many years ago. And in some instances, in some jurisdictions, we just have a cycle of people who are coming up for their retirements at their 20 and 30-year marks. But in any event, let's try and make sure we get the evidence and the data so we can correct those challenges. It's not just fixing the slogan on the street. It's a dangerous job, doesn't pay as much as it should. Many of the officers or potential officers find that they can have jobs that pay as much and don't have to work as hard. For example, Homeland Security, I remember the Border Patrol agents testifying that they're having trouble retaining officers at the border, not because of a defund the police slogan, but because they can leave the job and make more money doing other things and stay in the same community, and it's less taxing than being an officer. If we're honest about it, then we can come up with better solutions to try and retain them, like maybe paying them more money. But if we just keep spreading rhetoric about this is defund the police, we won't fix the problem and we won't get more officers. If money is the issue, and of course it's a factor, then just standing here and haranguing about defunding the police doesn't fix it. We have to find ways to raise the salaries and help attract and retain more of them to go out on the street. Now, I'm going to stop with this at the moment. You know, I first went into law enforcement in 1990 as a prosecutor, and I took it seriously then. The gentleman on the other side is accusing Democrats of not being serious about police. We have police officers, former police officers here on this side of the aisle who are Democrats, and I know them all across the country. And not only that, every time I've run for office, I've been endorsed by the FOP in my jurisdiction. So it's a little unfortunate to sort of use those kinds of attacks to justify the resolution that is proposed here. Let's get serious. Let's get back to doing things that actually will address the problems and retain more police officers, recruit more police officers, address the concerns that we have with respect to keeping them safe on the street. And yes, gun violence is a big factor in the dangers that they face on the streets. And so I think it's kind of hard to be serious about protecting them if we're not even going to discuss that. My colleague from Virginia mentioned that he thinks we want to make sure that they're 21. If you wait till they're 21, it undermines their Second Amendment rights. And I appreciate that. I don't agree with that take, but let me say this. Ghost guns, I haven't come across anybody that thinks those make sense. They are intentionally designed to avoid prosecution. They don't have any numbers on them in order to avoid being tracked in the event of use for a criminal enterprise. And the use of ghost guns and crimes on the street is exploding. We need to get our Republican colleagues to help us support legislation like that. We're having trouble finding it, but today would be the day. Oh, and by the way, we're talking about killings on the street. It's handguns primarily, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, that are leading to officers' deaths on the streets. So if we're really serious about protecting police officers, can't we do something to try and address that? Can't we do something to try and limit the number of guns on the street? Oh, and by the way, too, I know that the argument's going to be, hey, you guys are soft on crime and all of that, but remember, a lot of the people who commit these crimes don't have prior offenses. Like the two that killed the deputies, the guy that killed the two deputies in my jurisdiction, Arno and Magruder, he didn't have any prior record. He had mental health issues. We can't just assume that all of these issues revolve around people who have long criminal records, because they don't. And many times police officers are killed on the street by people with no prior records. Let's try and address all of these issues in a serious way, in a bipartisan way, because that's the way to actually help keep our police officers safe on the street. And with that, I reserve.